guys, welcome to another episode of the Make Me Whole podcast. I'm your host here, Joset Rosado, and today we are joined by Dr. Birgitte Tan, who is a transformational coach and wonderful provider who speaks directly to the heart of the movement of grief. And we thought it would be a great opportunity to have a conversation about something that is so hard for us to talk about when we are dealing with things that are difficult and stuff that we usually shy away from, I would say. So I want to give Dr. Tan the opportunity to talk a little bit about, who you are. Tell us about what got you to becoming a transformational coach and what your passion is in your movement.
Thank you so much, Josette. Thank you. And it is such an honor and a delight to be with you and the audience today. And what got me into doing the grief work is a good part of it is my own life experience. I've experienced grief since I was 5. And I spent quite a lot of time. I invested quite a lot of time trying to recover from there, to release the grief and be able to create the result I love. And with that come many experience finding things that work, finding things that many things that don't work, and I also, so that started me to work in the grief. And my formal training initially is in medicine, and I was in emergency medicine, which we see all the acute grief, so to say. And from there, I moved to oncology.
Wow.
Some people says you go from the frying pan to right into the fire.
I'm telling you, yeah.
And I'm yet to know. I've done that for a few decades now, and in the few decades I was in oncology, I'm yet to know a single person that come in and said, "Hallelujah, I got cancer." It doesn't happen that way.
I can't
It's
imagine. Wow.
grief and anticipatory grief in every form one can imagine. And so from my own life experience, from wanting to be able to help others who who has experienced grief, whether it's accumulations from childhood or it's an acute grief or something that just happened.
Yeah, I would imagine that for a lot of individuals, especially who are dealing with family members or loved ones who are experiencing cancer diagnoses and just the treatment of cancer alone, um, those steps and that process in itself is hard enough to deal with without, tapping into processing feelings, processing what it is that you're experiencing and how to manage that. Because I don't think enough people do. You're caught up in, well, what's the treatment and what's the next steps and what is it that you are planning on handling as far as family or, your estate or your children or your partners. And so I'm just wondering, how has your experience with that help that population and what made you move from being a medical professional to a healer?
So grief caused us, including anticipatory grief, which is the grief that we experience when something that you don't want to happen is looming. And so both grief and anticipatory grief, and it could be the anticipatory grief of getting a treatment, the anticipatory grief of having a significant test, and it could be the anticipatory grief from a family member that they received the bad news, and it's a higher stage cancer, and now everybody, in the back of their mind, many times we try not to say it, but in the back of our mind, who are like, okay, I'm gonna lose this person anytime soon, and all this. And so any of those, any form of grief, as you might have known with your knowledge and skill, Josette, grief causes us to be confused, to be indecisive, not being able to think correctly, and to get discouraged and fearful, and in addition to the sadness or anger. Many people don't know, and they say, "Oh, actually, I'm not sad, but I feel so irritable and angry. What's wrong with me?" And that's just an expression of grief. The number one expression of grief is actually anger, and so by and that's impacted people so much. And what we are telling ourselves can come into reality, and being able to have guidance in that makes such a big difference in the clinical part of things. In clinical oncology, the oncologists and the nurses even know a term, anticipatory emesis. And what anticipatory emesis is, people think they're going to get sick from treatment,
Hmm.
and they actually start vomiting or feeling sick, like in the parking lot
Right.
or at home, before they even receive the treatment that might or might not make them sick. And so it's such an important thing for people to be able to navigate this, and allow them to be able to receive the treatment. If you're walking in there, you're already vomiting, they say, we can't treat you. How are we going to do this? If before you take the pill, even if the pill at home, there are some clients that, because they had their past experience, they're going to take the pill, and they're just like, oh my God, I already feel like I'm having a stomach ache and I'm vomiting. You can't take your medication. And being able to navigate this, having the guidance of being able to focus on what you would want, and being able to think clearly. And I was speaking with somebody who actually do a nonprofit for cancer, providing informations, and they said the syndrome, the not wanting to not being left out, which is being able to have the energy and the mental clarity to check things out and look things up. Those are all very important in cancer or any illness and any condition or any life problem, really, when we're navigating through that. And we want to make sure that we're not clouded by our minds, not clouded by grief, and
Right.
being and all other things, and being able to be clear about our actions and have help if we're not able to do it on our own.
Why do you think so many people shy away from allowing themselves to grieve? Grief seems to, or being, allowing themselves to grieve seems to cause fear.
A good part of that, at least in a lot of society, in the Western society in particular, a good part, and some other society as well, a good part of that is the stigma. There's a major stigma about grief being, if you're grieving, it's weakness, even though it's actually a very natural and human process. That is
Hmm.
one, I would say. And the other part is, it's a human nature, actually not just human nature, it's every living being nature, whether it's animal, human, plants, of not wanting some things that's uncomfortable and unpleasant, and we don't know how to deal with. Nobody want to feel horrible. I have a
Right.
cat here. Something's uncomfortable for him. He move away or he fight back or something. And so nobody want to feel uncomfortable. And in people in particular, we don't want to feel uncomfortable, but we really don't want to feel uncomfortable in something that we don't know how to handle. It's kind of
Right.
like, you go to the gym and you know you're going to be uncomfortable for about an hour because you got to be sitting there and run and huff and push and all these things. But you're like, okay, I got a plan here. I'm going to be able to do da. And you might even have a trainer that help you push. And then you know you're going to be okay. You know you're going to be okay during the time. You're going to be okay afterward. Then many of us say, all right, fine. You know what? I'll go to the gym and suffer, so to say, for an
Right.
hour. But if you don't know how, and you think you're going to get hurt even more because it feels so horrible, then nobody would put themselves with that. And with grief, there are so many misunderstandings. There's so many myths about grief, as well as we go to school. Many of us go through school, even in the advanced educations, going through college and so forth. We get a lot of education, about a lot of things. Depend on where you live. When I live part-time California, part-time Nevada. In California, they train you from grade school. If earthquake happened, you do A, B, C. Here's plan. This plan how to prepare for it. This plan da 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 da. And there's no such a thing for grief, even
Right.
though grief happen a lot more in life and a lot more consistently if you continue on living, being adult, than earthquake that might happen every 25 years. But there is no such a thing on grief preparedness versus tornado preparedness. And so we don't
Right.
know how to handle it. And it's so unpleasant and it gets scary. And then there's also the stigma.
In your own experience, how do you think unresolved grief affects someone's overall wellness?
So, unresolved grief, incompletely resolved grief, affects people in much more way than they are able to, than we in general, most people able to imagine. And unfortunately, it even in this day and age, many primary care providers
Mhm.
do not recognize the symptoms. We know that grief, firstly, is cumulative and cumulatively destructive. In other words, you might think something happened when you were 5, and something happened when you were 15, and when you were 25, and now you're 40 years old. And then this happened, and you wonder, wow, something seemingly less significance in your mind to it happen, and it just make you fell apart. What the heck happened? But grief is cumulative and cumulatively destructive. And with that in mind, grief that is not completely resolved adds on to each other. And we know very well that grief has the physical impact is one. So much so you might have heard the term of die from heart attack.
Right.
And it's not just a romantic expressions. We know that it's actually truly happened. The impact of grief on heart has a fancy term called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. Try to say that really fast, right?
Very fancy word, right?
um, but grief can cause change in our physical heart. Nowadays, they're looking about the impact of unresolved grief on the brain, on
Hmm.
dementia, and wonder if that's contribute to that. We know that grief is can be transferred, unresolved grief, to the next generation. There is such a thing called transgenerational grief. You probably have heard about this. Most people don't. But transgeneration grief, because grief change our DNA methylations, which is the way the DNA being processed in the body. So just think about it. Something happened, a grief happened, and you kind of like, oh, going along with, and you might, after some time, you might not feel the intense initial sadness or anger or angst, but it's actually continuing on working its way in your body, changing your DNA, and passing it, and influencing your physical body, and even passing it to the next generations and the next
Wow.
generation and the next generations. We see this a lot in family who initially were Holocaust survivor, people who are from the Native Americans, and like First People in Canada, and all these different things. Anybody people who has moved, like the great grandparents moved from a place because there was a war or something, and then they move, and then they're like, well, we got to keep pushing, because we got to survive, which is very true. And at the same time, that grief sits in their system, passed to the next, and a lot of people, funny, I was having this actually incidentally, I believe, on my feed, on my social media post this week, talking about people sometimes like, why am I so sensitive? Why am I this? And a lot of people don't know and say, oh, you just born wimpy. Really? Somebody
Right.
born
It's
wimpy?
not,
What a
it's not
concept.
at all.
That's
Mm-hmm.
not true. It might be something from before. Now, and then also it is the physical impact. A lot of client, I was speaking somebody on I do a free life grief chat on Wednesday evening, and somebody was coming in and said, I'm feeling this, and I'm feeling this and this and this physically, and it was so much of incompletely resolved grief that the person was not allowed to grieve and experience when things first happen. And then also we mentioned grief clouds our mind and make us fearful and make us not able to kind of gauge things well if we're all confused. And naturally and make us reactive, triggers causing PTSD, and all
Right.
those will influence our relationship with people, our loved one, but also our work. If you can, if you don't think clearly at work and keep making mistake, we all know what's gonna happen. And so it's so much more impact from incompletely resolved grief.
Absolutely. And I wonder, what is your approach to helping someone navigate the beginnings or the middles of their grief journey?
Thank you. Well, my approach is what I say the three-dimensional, five prongs three-dimensional approach. We know now that grief impacted more than just our mind. Actually, the mind is a part of that. But if you ever have this experience where you understand why something happened, perhaps somebody passed and you understand, the person was 89 years old and has not been comfortable. So in your mind you can even say, yeah, I got that. It's actually good for the person to pass because he or she been suffering all this time, and at the same time in your heart you still crying. In different scenario, people who are in an abusive relationship, sometimes we hear, you know what, I absolutely know it's good for my children and for me to be out of that house. Holy moly. And strangely enough, in their heart they still cry and sad, and there is sometimes even, oh, how I wish things different, I wish I could turn things around, was it my
Right.
guilt, even though it's absolutely not their fault, and so forth. So grief is one of those that impact your mind, which is actually the easiest part to take care, and then it's also get to your heart, and even more importantly, we just talk about how it changed our DNA and our physical thing, it gets to your cells. And so
Right.
my approach is a comprehensive approach where I help you release grief from your heart, from the cells in your body, so from your physical body, and as well as your mind. Many of my clients are either in therapy or been through therapy. And so many time therapy is really, really good for this, for releasing it from their mind. They come with an understanding. I understand ABC, but I'm just still feeling it in my heart. And then it start getting to my health. I'm starting to have skin problem. I'm starting to have stomach problem or nonstop
Right.
headache or what have you. And so I help people regard wherever you are in that grief journey, when you feel call and your heart is saying, you know what, it's need to be the next step, we need to see what we are able to do, so you are able to actually release the grief, and actually when it comes to a loss of a person you love the person even more, while you continue to stay healthy and live well with your loved one who's still here. But I use a comprehensive approach to safely release it from your heart, your body, and as well as your mind.
Okay. I think one of the questions that often comes up with many of the clients that I work with is the timetable. Like, aren't I supposed to be feeling better by now? This person maybe passed away so long ago. I even have a very dear grandmother who really had a huge hand in raising me, and she's been gone now about 13 years. And sometimes I'll think about her and I'll get, choked up when I think about our memories together or just how passionately I love her. Um, but there are people who still struggle with the intensity of their grief for their loved ones, even though they've been grieving for upwards of 10, 15 years. Is there a true timetable to grief?
So everybody has their own timetable. And firstly, like what you experience, that's normal. It's called love. You care about your grandmother, and it might be 20 years from now when you remember her, you say, you know what, some Christmas happened or something happened, you went to a place and you're like, wow, grandma used to do this. Well, I sure wish grandma's still here, and your heart open
Hmm.
and you choked up a little bit. And that is normal. There's a normal, and then there is when you are just it's just being human. It's called because you know how to love. The grief is the other side of love, right? And so it's called being know how to love. And at the same time, if you are in pain, if it's interfering with your life, if it is been whether it is 1 year, 3 years, 15 years, and everybody different. But if you start noticing it's been 3 years or 1 year, or for some people it's been 3 months, and you say, I'm still crying. Now, if it is something that's two things, if it starts impacting you beside your feelings, in other words,
Hmm.
it's giving you constant headache, where the physical anything, it start causing strain in your relationship, at your work, whatever it is, then perhaps you want to take the actions to release the grief. And otherwise, I tend to say, don't give grief time, because time does not heal grief. Time complicates grief, but give
Hmm.
yourself the time you need. Everybody has different speeds. Some people say, I this is really just on in 6 months. It's caused so much physical problem and health and relationship and work problem, and I want to release the pain. Now, some people mistaken about releasing the pain versus not loving and not remembering. When you
Right,
release grief and you release the pain, it has absolutely nothing to do with not being able to love the person anymore. You're actually
right.
able to love the person even more, because now you will be able to remember about them, to think about them, to talk about them with a lot more ease, and you're more likely to do that. If you anytime you think about somebody, it make you cry or make you break down or make you feel physical pain, being human, we're not going to want to do that. We don't want to be suddenly breaking down in a grocery talking about mom or grandma or somebody. On the other hand, when you are able to release the pain, you meet somebody, you say, oh yeah, that you're cooking that, my grandma used to do that. You're celebrating and cherishing your mom or grandma, or maybe it's your dog. But so everybody's different timeline. But if it start impacting you, or it start to becoming years after years after years, and you're still feeling the pain, then perhaps it is time. And we know that you need to release grief, to do anything. You need to take actions, to take the correct action. Time does not heal grief.
Okay. And that's important to hear because people oftentimes will say, give it some time, you'll feel better. Just when you're removed from it for a little while, you'll feel better about it. But it really is about one, allowing yourself to feel, because that's one thing I feel is so important. Giving the honor to whatever it is you're going through, but also knowing that if it's starting to interfere with day to day
Yeah.
and any kinds of relationships, it might be the time to get to higher ground and seek some more help.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And
for
even
someone, Mhm.
even early on. Now you might not jump to the a grief specialist right away because not everybody needing a grief specialist really. But even early on, so many people on the chat on the live grief tips that I do. So many people come and say, "I'm doing this. Am I going crazy?" And you know, whether you talk with a grief coach at the time or even if you talk with a counselor or a therapist, the therapist, even if the therapist is not a grief specialist, it is still helpful to
Yes,
from the very get go, from something happened, whether you hear somebody, a loved one has a bad an unpleasant diagnosis, or you lost a person, go get some support so you don't sit there and say, am I going crazy, am I should be doing this already, am I not that already? And your therapist know when what's going on and can help you and guide you step by step, week by week. And if you need to you can go to a grief specialist, but a lot of support, because so many times we don't know and we think we're going crazy, and while you
yeah,
actually
no, I believe it. I believe it. For someone who might be listening who's in the midst of grief, what would be your message of hope or encouragement to them?
So, my message of hope is that if you take the correct actions, allowing the correct guidance, then it is absolutely possible to move through and beyond your grief. And I did not just notice, I did not say to get over it or something like that, but to move through and beyond your grief. There are certain things happen in our life that will change us forever. But it is up to you. Firstly, how where do you want that change to go to? Do you want that change to make you become sort of sad, or even impair in your relationship and your work and your ability to cherish your loved one forever, or do you want it to bring it into a better place? And then the second part is that yes, it changed us forever. This other part is to know that whatever going on, it's also up to you. And a lot of time people said, how do I know? A lot of time people can sense this in themselves. They're kind of like, okay, you know what, right now I'm just, it feels good to start cry, to just cry and cry every day and cry every day. It feels good to be doing that. But then at some point you're like, I'm still crying. And for some, this is 3 months, and for some, this is 3 years. And when you start feeling that, that's when you say, okay, I feel stuck in here. Once you feel like you're on a plateau where you are stuck or something, then you absolutely want to seek more help. If you're already being helped and it's making you feel stuck, seek more help to be able to continue to move through and beyond your grief. And just know that it's possible. One of my client has, back then, he had grief that he carried for over 70 years. Happened when he was in his, and he was in his 80s, and even after that long, it is possible to fully recover from the grief, fully
My
release the
goodness.
grief, and feel freedom and ease and joy and full spectrum health and life again.
So important. All right, tell us where people can find you. Where are your Wednesday groups? How can they reach out to you if they are in need of your help and your services?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me in multiple locations. If you have a questions, firstly, you're welcome to connect with me on my website. It's joyfulrichesbeyondgrief.com. Joyful, and then riches is like a full spectrum riches, RICHES beyondgrief.com. You are welcome to email me directly. The easiest email to use is Dr. Tan for grief at gmail.com. That's doctor, it's abbreviated as DR. So DRTAN for grief at gmail.com, DRTANFOR grief at gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook for sure. That is Birgitte Tan. You can find me on Facebook under From Grieving to Joyful Living is the formal page. You can also find me on Instagram as well, Joyful Living. So in multiple different places.
Yes, and I'll be sure to put all of your information in the description. So if anybody's looking to link up with you, it'll be in our description of the podcast episode. Dr. Tan, it has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. And I know that the information that you shared with us is invaluable. So thank you so much for just being here and sharing this with us. I hope that everyone who's listening can really get some valuable insight as to managing grief and normalizing it because
And,
we
and,
need to
and
start doing that.
And for everyone listening, if you say, I'm not sure if I should talk to a grief specialist or not, just as an honor to you, Joset, for anyone listening, if they mention your name and they reach out to me, I will give them a complimentary initial
Thank
consultation.
you.
Just make
Thank you
sure you
so
mention
much.
Joset. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone who's listening. And we're going to sign off for right now. But thank you, Dr. Tan, for your coming and gracing us with your presence today on
Thank,
our show. And everyone who was listening, enjoy the podcast, and I'll see you on the next one.
thank you.